So last month marked, in my opinion, and I'm sure others would share this opinion, the official 10-year anniversary as to when the Mecha Sally arc really began. I mean, basically, to do a quick summary, last month marked when 225 originally was published under the Archie license, and then that led us into the Sonic Genesis arc, which was 226 to 229 to celebrate his 20th anniversary. Then that led us to 230, which was basically the epilogue, the ending, the final chapter, if you will. And the final page on that, in that issue, I should say, introduced us to Mecha Sally, basically a roboticized version of Princess Sally Acorn, who sacrificed herself to basically destroy the global roboticizer by having the robotization process aimed at her. So, yeah. Last month, in my opinion, and again, like I said, others might share this opinion, marked the official beginning of that entire scenario, which has gone down, in my opinion, and others again would share the same opinion, as one of the more controversial decisions and stories that Ian Flynn has ever wrote, up until the recent Metal Virus arc that we got in IDW. But, with that said, this morning I was kind of thinking about something just out of curiosity. And when I looked up the release date, I came to the realization that in December of 2023, it will mark 20 years since this story arc officially began. And the story arc I'm talking about is known as Mobius Years Later. Originally 25 years later, and then later 30 years later. But basically, the entire name of the scenario of the story arc, of the timeline, if you will, the continuity, is Mobius Years Later. Now, this was a story series, or at least a sub-story series, that was created by Ken Penders originally. And the reason Ken had created this was because he wanted to give us a glimpse, I guess, as to what the characters would be like in the future. What scenarios they would be involved in, where the paths led them to, how they intertwined, stuff like that, as well as give us an idea of what their offspring would look like and how it would act as well. And that's all cool and everything. That's really all cool, except the fact, and that's the noon whistle going off here in Newman, except the fact that after Ken Penders had left the Sonic book and left Archie Comics, if you will, Ian Flynn came on board and basically made it his goal to establish that Mobius Years Later was not what Ken Penders had originally intended it to be, that it was entirely something different. And what Ken Penders originally, and if I read off this in a minute, read off this article that I got off the Sonic News Network fandom page, if what I read off here, is in agreement with me, Ken Penders originally wanted Mobius Years Later to be the future of the continuity. In other words, no what ifs, no, possible dreams or prophet dreams the character's gonna have, giving them a glimpse into the future, stuff like that, or a possible future. No. Ken Penders made it clear, and again, if this article kind of backs me up on that possibly, made it clear that his Mobius Years Later story arc was the definitive future of the continuity. But like I said, when Ian Flynn came on board, that entirely went out the window, because Ian Flynn, along with those that were supporting him and backing him up, said, no, we are not going to have this as the definitive future, but we can have it as an alternate reality. In other words, a reality that gives you an idea of what a future or a possible future could look like under, under the whole Sonic continuity that we were used to. Basically, they turned it into a what-if possible scenario, is what I'm trying to get at. And look, I get that Sega and Archie and even Ian Flynn were not particularly fond of Ken Penders wanting that to be the definitive future, which is why they made the decision they did. However, what I'm about to read here hopefully will give us more insight as to what is going on. basically give us more insight as to what's going on. Now, if I do reread some of this, I do apologize because I want to make sure I get it correct, I get it right. But this is from, like I said, Sonic News Network fandom page, and I quote, the history, we're going to start with the history, unaltered. This is the unaltered history. And I quote, between present and future, this is what they said, and I quote, various events are known to have taken place somewhere along the timeline between the present timeline in okay, let me reread that. Between present and future, history unaltered. And I quote, various events are known to have taken place somewhere along the timeline between the present timeline seen in Mobius Prime's present and the possible future. When Dr. Eggman's empire began to collapse, he sought out the help of Dimitri, who was still on life support. When the ancient Echidna refused to help him due to his change in ideology, the enraged Dr. Eggman ripped him from his life support unit. Because of this, Dimitri was reduced to a cyborg head contained within a floating glass ball to preserve his life. Continuing on. Sometime after this, Dr. Eggman stole the Master Emerald, causing Knuckles to once again transform into Chaos Knuckles, which was the green super form of his. The Chaos-empowered Echidna then used his power to wipe out Eggman once and for all. Following this, Chaos Knuckles began to reshape the world as he saw fit, removing Julie Sue's cybernetics. Feeling that Knuckles was now a threat, Sonic threatened to use a device called the Nullifier to neutralize Knuckles' powers. The device went off prematurely, returning the Guardian to normal, but also badly damaging his right eye. Refusing to accept a cloned eye due to his beliefs, Knuckles instead chose to use a cybernetic eyepiece. So basically, this is part of what he had planned, that, you know, it would get to, and this right here is an example of what Ken Penders was really focused on besides just writing Sonic stories. Ken Penders was known, and it's obvious when you take a look at his progress with the Lawless Sue Chronicles, Ken Penders was known to be very in-depth with wanting to, you know, learn more about about Knuckles' history, about his Echidna past and all that, and why he was the Guardian of the Master Emerald, as well as some of the Chaos Emeralds. So Ken Penders basically made it his goal to not only learn more about it, but to expand on it, to give it more meaning, give it a lore that would be worthy, I guess, of the lore that you would see in DC and in Marvel with some of their titles. Now, continuing on, and I quote, in 3243, Sonic and Sally tied the knot and got married. However, King Max did not abdicate from the throne for the first 2 years of their marriage. So in other words, Sonic and Sally, much to the happiness, if you will, a lot of fans, when it comes to this storyline, they did get married, but because the king was still able to rule, he didn't, you know, Sally's father, he did not, you know, remove himself from the throne until the time was right. Continuing on, and I quote, in 3246, Locke, that's L-O-C-K-E, developed terminal cancer. After telling Lala Lee he always loved her, and apologizing to Knuckles for the way he raised him, Locke died peacefully in his sleep on the 61st day of that year. Continuing on. At some point, Tails settled down and married Mina Mongoose, or Mina Mongoose, depending on how you pronounce her name. Let me reread that. At some point, Tails settled down and married Mina Mongoose, or Mina Mongoose, and had 2 children with her. Tails left with his family to move to Down Under, which is the equivalent of Australia. For some reason, Sonic and Tails had a falling out and were no longer on speaking terms, to the extent that Sonic refused to show up at the airport to say goodbye. Kind of think along the lines of almost like a Batman-Robin scenario, and Robin went off and did his own thing, and Batman wasn't there to see him off when he decided to go elsewhere and stuff. Kind of think along those lines, if you will. Continuing on, and I quote, in 3260, the Kingdom of Acorn had to deal with the Overlander uprising. Knuckles was unable to provide assistance as he was preoccupied with the drone problem, which was apparently contributed to the uprising. Continuing on, this is now that was the unaltered history, as it puts it here, the unaltered history, and I will provide a link in the description. You guys could check it out yourself if you want to read it and all that. But continuing on, and I quote, 25 years later, 3261. This is another subject. They basically broke it up into categories. So now we're at 25 years later, which is the year 3261, and that's where the title Mobius 25 years later comes into play. Continuing on, and I quote, originally in this future, prior to his alterations, the status quo of Mobius had dramatically changed during the years past as up till 3230. Okay, let me reread that, because I think whoever puts these on these fandom pages don't reread what they type. And that's okay though. And I quote, 25 years later, 3261, and I quote, originally in the future prior to his alterations, the status quo of Mobius had dramatically changed during the years past up until 3261. Mobius enjoyed a state of peace and prosperity. Hold on for a sec. Okay, what was I? Oh yeah. Mobius enjoyed a state of peace and prosperity, with most, if not all, past antagonists destroyed or permanently defeated. The kingdom of Acorn was currently under the rule of King Sonic and Queen Sally, who were married and had 2 children named Princess Sonia and Prince Manic. And those names sound familiar. It's because this was around, this was basically several years after Sonic Underground had aired and been canceled. So Ken Penders decided to take the names of Sonia, Sonic's sister in that series, and Manic, his brother, and give them to his children in this series. Continuing on. However, due to past events, Sonic appeared to have grown distant towards his old friend Miles Tails Prower, and openly hostile towards Knuckles. Sally put up with this, believing that her husband was going through a midlife crisis and the pressures of ruling without being raised to do so. And that is indeed true, because when you read the story, that is indeed true, but there's more to it. There's more to it, because in all honesty, from what I read when I first, from what I saw when I first read it, is that basically Sonic, being Sonic, just, well, it kind of gets shown later on when Ian Flynn took over the story arc, but Sonic being Sonic, not only does he admit that, hey, I'm not used to this, I wasn't raised to do this like you were, Sally, because of the fact that Sonic, he still wants to run. He still wants to go out and fight. He still wants to do this and that, but because the planet is at peace right now and has prosperity going for it, there's not really much he can do. There's not really much he can do. But now, continuing on, and I quote, Angel Island had become a tranquil republic, no longer the battleground for conflict between the Dark Legion and the rest of the island's echidna population. Knuckles and his girlfriend Julie Sue were paired up, though not civilly married, as they believed that commitment was more important than ceremony. The 2 of them also had a daughter named Lala Sue. And of course we know where that's going. Who was constantly dismayed at her father's refusal to let her become a member of the Brotherhood of Guardians, because he didn't want her to go through the same sadness he did as Guardian. The Brotherhood continued its vigil over Mobius from hiding, though the group's members were somewhat diminished with the death of Knuckles' father, Locke, and the reduction of Knuckles' grandfather, Saber, to a vegetative state. Easy for me to say. Lin Da controlled the Dark Legion and had a son by the name of Rutan. That's R-U-T-A-N, Rutan, as a changed man who also believed, okay, let me read that. Lin Da controlled the Dark Legion and had a son by the name of Rutan. Dimitri, as a changed man, also lived with the 2 of them and believed that Lin Da should mend her relationship with Julie Sue. The 2 apparently disagreed over a number of subjects, but remained civil. In other words, the way he wrote Linda, he was basically trying to redeem her in this future. That being Ken Penders. But continuing on, as I check there we go. Continuing on, I quote, "As for the other freedom fighters and the chaotics, a number of things for them had changed as well. Rotor had become an emissary of the Kingdom of Acorn. SBO was currently married and serving as Knuckles' secretary, having 2 daughters by the name of Salma and Juanita, though it is known that Salma was involved in having a relationship with Runtan. Vector the Crocodile was also married and had a son named Argyle." And later on, it's kind of, not just here, but when Ian Flynn took over, it's pretty much hinted that Argyle and Lala Sue were kind of an item as well, or getting to be an item. Continuing on, and I quote, "Unfortunately, this future had a major crisis facing it. Following the celebration of Lala Sue's 16th birthday, King Sonic's family paid a visit to Angel Island. When Sonic met with Knuckles, he learned that Mobius faced imminent destruction. Numerous occasions of immense stress on the space-time continuum, including Sonic's access of the cosmic interstate, the activation of the Ultimate Annihilator during the final battle with Dr. Robotnik, and the detonation of the Zorda's quantum dial, the fabric of space and time was in danger of collapsing, which would cause Mobius to be destroyed. In an attempt to fix the problem, Sonic and Knuckles agreed to a truce. Sonic agreed to use the displacement chamber, or the Taxon displacement chamber, a time machine built by Eggman and kept in storage for years, to travel to the past and collect information so that the problem could be rectified. Before departing, Knuckles visited Locke's grave and, remembering their final days together, realized that in not letting Lala Sue become a guardian, he was making the same mistake his father did, and agreed to let Lala Sue become a guardian, and she stowed away aboard the transport. Sonic entered the chamber, but something went wrong and he disappeared. Lala Sue vanished at the same time, and the timeline was irrevocably altered, or whatever they want to call it. So in other words, to kind of get up to date here, basically Ken Penders, when he ended it right there, Ken Penders obviously had plans to continue it, but he also had plans to essentially leave it up to the imagination of the reader, like, okay, what happens next? What's the next step? And that apparently was going to be basically be what is happening, or what he has planned happening with the Lala Sue Chronicles. That was the plan. That was the plan that I think he wanted to conclude in a storyline that's similar, I think, to what he's doing with Lala Sue Chronicles right now. But he never got a chance to do so because he had other stories he was working on, not just in the book, but with other publishers. And I think, honestly, word had gotten out. This is my opinion. I don't know if this is true or not, but I think word had gotten to Sega and mostly the Sonic team here in America about what Ken looked at or kind of presented Mobius years later to be. And the people at Sega here in America and the Sonic team was like, no, that's not going to fly. Now, again, I don't know if that's true or not, but I can assume it may have been, because this next part is when Ian Flynn took over, and that kind of assumption for me, I think kind of fits the bill. But continuing, and I quote, next category, altered. This is the next category, altered. As I check something real quickly, I'll be right back. Okay. Just checking something, guys. All right, so next up we have altered. Between present and future. So this is altered, and I quote, as a result of King Sonic's journey to the past, Light Mobius had been changed almost beyond recognition. Due to Sonic's apparent disappearance and presumed death during the Second Robotnik War, Shadow the Hedgehog both rescued and conquered the war. Okay, let me reread that. As altered between present and future. As a result of King Sonic's journey to the past, like Mobius had been changed and beyond recognition. Due to Sonic's apparent disappearance and presumed death during the Second Robotnik War, Shadow the Hedgehog, quote-unquote, both rescued and conquered the war-torn planet Mobius within 1 year's time. Shadow's regime managed to bring peace and stability to all of Mobius, though his regime resorted to brutal methods. According to Knuckles in the story, quote, things may have been bad under King Shadow, but at least he knew how to keep the warmongers in line. Continuing on, and I quote, sometime after, the much-loved Queen Sally married King Shadow, and she was able to ease some of the harsh rules and punishments of Shadow's regime. There was no love between the two, and Shadow married her only for political connections. The Dark Presence, under the leadership of Linda, became his secret enforcers, while Knuckles and the Chaotix became his legitimate law-keeping force. The world trembled in fear of the organization and its ruthless efficiency. While some felt there was hope due to the humanitarian missions performed by Queen Sally. In addition to these changes, King Shadow turned Maria Robotnik into an iconic symbol of worship. Furthermore, the world capital was relocated to the merchant city of Portal on Angel Island in 3262. Continuing on, and I quote, at some unknown point, the Exis resurgence occurred, followed by the Elemental War. During the crisis, Tikal was forced to bind herself to Chaos in an effort to control him. The result was the creation of Tikalus, which is basically Tikal's name merged with Chaos' name. Tikalus. The new being was extremely unstable, and the Tikal portion would lose control if provided with too much Chaos power. Thus, Tikalus was subdued and quarantined in the catacombs beneath Castle Mobius. So basically, that's an explanation of what happened, afterwards. But continuing on, and this is where Ian Flynn, and most of this is when Ian Flynn came on board and took over. And I'm just checking my time there. Okay, just checking the time, guys. Hold on. All right, just checking something there. Okay, but continuing on, and I quote. New category, 25 years later, 3262, now under the altered regime, or under the altered universe. Although these negative changes took place, the damage to the time-space continuum was repaired, ending any danger of Mobius being destroyed. However, a handful of Mobians had escaped, losing their memories of the original timeline thanks to being near the displacement chamber when it went off, or though use of technology devices. Approaching the year of 3262, due to his power of chaos control, King Shadow was aware of the timeline changes and went about capturing all those who retained their memories to prevent them from acting against him. Two unfortunate victims, Rhoda and Kobar, were locked up and tortured, and the latter was presumably killed by King Shadow. Tails, having preserved his family and memories from the timeline changes, sought out the help of Knuckles and Sonic to remove King Shadow from power. Continuing on. And before I do that, basically what Ian Flynn established in his version of it is that, Shadow pretty much knew about what happened and was going to be pretty much, damned that he was going to let anything change that. Because as described, in the recent category, he made Maria Robotnik a worship symbol, basically a goddess, if you know what I mean. So, but continuing on. And like I said, he'd be damned if he let anything change. But I can continue on, and I quote. Having retained her memories, Lala Sue found a world far different from what she left behind. As a result of the alteration, several of her friends... Let me reread that. Having retained her memories, Lala Sue found a world far different from what she left behind. As a result of the alteration, several of her friends had ceased to exist, namely Sonia and Manic. Now, what's interesting about Sonia and Manic is Sonia, in the Ken Penders version, was basically the same age as Lala Sue. Manic, we'll put it this way, was kind of like around, let's say, a few years younger, and he had a thing for Lala Sue, if you know what I mean. But continuing on, and I quote, "Thus, she offered to join Tails in his quest to both locate Sonic and take down King Shadow after her father refused to help. Tails, Lala Sue, after her father refused to help Tails." That's what I was trying to read. Lala Sue and Tails eventually found Sonic living on the streets of the city of Portal as a hobo. Sonic reconciled with Tails, believing that if he couldn't fix the past back to the way it was, then he could at least fix his friendship with him now. However, the three were then arrested by Knuckles. Continuing on. After the three were in prison, Knuckles revealed that he had arrested them merely as a deception, and so they could get close to the king. Lala Sue, Knuckles, Tails, and Sonic then launched a coup, if you will, against King Shadow, besieging Castle Mobius. Although Sonic was quickly defeated by Shadow, Lala Sue managed to freeze the despot in time with her knowledge of chaos control. Thus, King Shadow's reign came to an end, and Knuckles was convinced of her worthiness to be a guardian. Sonic spoke to Sally afterwards, who considered her marriage with Shadow annulled, and the two rekindled the old love. So, what Ken Penders did, not Ken Penders, but what Ian Flynn did here, is essentially, he went in a direction, again, here's the thing. I don't know if this is what Ken Penders wanted to do, but this is what Ian Flynn did. So Ian Flynn went in a direction to where, you have a character like Shadow who's powerful enough to, rescue a world and everything, but at the same time, not only rescue it, but take it under his own control. Basically, rescue it for himself. So, basically what he did is he capitalized on the fact that, well, what would happen if Shadow had the power to not only rescue the world, but rescued it for his own means? What would he do? And what Ian Flynn did is he had Shadow marry Sally out of because of political connections. No love, and that's something that does happen in real life, believe it or not. Especially when it comes to royal politics in some places of the world. Again, that is a fact. Let's not lie to ourselves on that. We know it's a fact. But also what Ian Flynn did is not only did he come up with this idea of like I said, Shadow doing all this, but from what I can tell, it was Shadow's own way of finally making the world recognize Maria for the greatness that she is. Basically, he wanted the world to finally pay respect to Maria, which is why he did what he did. If you know what I mean. But what's interesting, and they don't bring it up here at all, is that Shadow is not the only one that knows about the previous timeline. Knuckles is not the only one either, nor Lala Sue or Tails, but Sally as well. Yeah, Sally knows about it because when he gets confronted by Sonic, Lala Sue, and all of them, Sally hears what Shadow said, and she's like, wait a minute, so you know about the previous timeline as well? Basically saying that she knows about it too. In a way, kind of asserting the fact that she was aware that something was off, but she had to do what she had to do to try to keep peace. Now, continuing on, and I quote though, as we get into the new category, 30 years later, 3267. Now, this is basically when Ian Flynn took over, and this is where he decided, okay, this world's an alternate universe. This is where that decision came in, and it kind of came in somewhat at the when he decided to continue the 25 years later deal, the altered version. But then when we got to 30 years later, that's when the decision was made, I think, that yeah, this is going to be an entirely different universe or reality. And I quote, or actually we start with the 5 years of peace first. 5 years of peace. In the summer of 3262, Sonic and Sally were in the summer of 3262, this is the 5 years of peace category. In the summer of 3262, Sonic and Sally married, with Sonic crowned king. Support for the change in regime was universal, according to News 11. In the spring of 3263, the royal twins Sonia and Manic were born. Continuing on. Thus now they're younger, they're just kids. Continuing on. And now we get into the 30 years later situation where again but Ian Flynn wanted this to kind of be an alternate reality. I think that's when this decision was made. We're continuing on, and I quote, although the majority of Mobius was at peace, some of the stability was lost when King Sonic took the throne. Both Knuckles and Julie Sue went off to conduct peace talks with a warring faction, while Vector and Kneecap went to attempt to discuss with the Mazoo separatists. An assassination attempt was also made on Sonic and his family, only for them to be saved by Silver the Hedgehog. Later, the Dark Presence kidnapped Miles and Mina Prower and took over Castle Mobius from within. King Shadow was also freed from his suspended animation by Linda. The royal family, except for Sonic, went into hiding with an unconscious Silver, while the king, Lola Sue, Melody Prower, and Sky Prower sought sanctuary with Argyle the crocodile. When they arrived, Argyle gave friendly greetings to everyone and bowed to Sonic. After explaining what happened, Argyle introduced everyone to Jock and Belle DeCoolid to help them assist thereby creating the future Freedom Fighters. Meanwhile, on Castle Mobius, King Shadow questioned Linda on what had happened in the time he was in suspended animation. After he explained, he prepared to release Tikhalis to teach the world a lesson. Linda tried to reason with him, but he tore off her spiritual armband so her position in the universe would change. In other words, she had like this. So in other words, one of the things that Ian Flynn did, especially with the antagonists, like the Dark Presence and Linda, is he had them supplied with an armband that would keep them in the timeline, keep them present in the timeline, but without it, they would be erased. And that's exactly what happened. Continuing on. Outside of the castle, King Sonic, Jock, and Belle took the direct approach, while Lola Sue, Sky, and Melody flew in. After Sky managed to take out a squad of the Dark Presence, Sonic managed to speak with his family. Back in the catacombs, a Dark Presence member alerted Shadow that King Sonic has retaken the castle before he gave Tikhalis an overdose of chaos energy and caused her to lose control. Just as the future Freedom Fighters prepared to attack the Dark Presence, they ran past them in terror before Perfect Tikhalis whipped apart the castle. The new Freedom Fighters were led into keeping Tikhalis at bay, while Sonic rescued his family and Silver from the ruins of the castle. When they got out, the Freedom Fighters, now assisted by Miles and Mina, told Sonic that they couldn't keep up the assault for much longer. Manic and Sonia came up with the idea of attacking Chaos's old weak spot, his exposed brain, to take him out. The Freedom Fighters then attempted this plan with Sonic as the lead, but he was stopped by the water monster. However, Sonia and Manic stepped in and attacked the monster for the father. Lola Sue then used Tikhal's prayer and allowed the monster to revert back to Tikhal's gentle side. The new Freedom Fighters celebrated the first victory of the new team. So, yeah. Basically, basically what Ian Flynn did here was he used the version of 30 years later not only to reintroduce us to these characters, these future the future children, if you will, of our main cast, but also create a new version of the Freedom Fighters. Basically, what he had done as well is he had established that, yeah, the old thread is gone, but a new threat is but there's always going to be threats, so you need a new group of freedom fighters. And what he did here is he's established the fact that, yeah, Sonic, you're king and everything, and you need to take care of stuff along with Sally, but now you got this new group, this new generation to step in for you, which includes your own kids. And what's interesting about it is when you look at that group image at the end of it, they kind of hint at the fact that there's more, there could be more going on between some of the characters, some of the children, if you will, I should say, easy for me to say, some of the children of the original group. Like, it's already established that Argyle and Lala Sue are kind of an item, right? Well, we kind of get a hint that Belle DeCoulet, the daughter of Antoine and Bunny, might have a thing for Sky. You know, and you're thinking, wait a minute. Sky Prower, who's basically Tails Jr., is being hit on by Belle? Yeah, you gotta think about that, you know. You gotta kind of think, that's an interesting dynamic. But what's even more crazy is that Jock, Antoine and Bunny's son, might have a thing for Melody. So, you know, it's really interesting, you know what I'm saying? But they do kind of tease, I think, something going on between them. But yeah, the whole Silver thing as well, when he showed up, excuse me, the whole Silver thing as well, when he showed up in Mobius 30 years later, it kind of played a factor. It kind of hinted at something that unfortunately we saw coming, or not saw coming, but unfortunately we witnessed happening, like I said earlier, 10 years ago. Because when he first arrived, because Ian Flynn, he put Silver into this storyline, into Mobius 30 years later for a reason. And that reason was because of the fact that he wanted to plant the seeds of what was to come, of what was to come and everything, because the storyline that Silver had for a while was, his world had been decimated, and it was all because of a traitor in the Freedom Fighters, but they weren't sure who that traitor was. They weren't sure of who it was. So when he went into the future of Mobius years later, and the other reason he did that as well, Ian Flynn wrote Silver into that situation, was to establish that this is a different universe, different reality, despite others, agreeing or disagreeing. Even Ken Penders disagreeing with that. The reason he had Silver show up in this was to, like I said, basically set the foundation, hint at the fact, right in front of us. Because when Silver talked with Sally, and she said some of the things she did, Silver, in his mind, is like, and you see the thought bubble, like, it can't be her. It can't be. Thus, kind of setting the table, if you will, of, yeah, if he's saying it can't be her, I think looking back on it now, we pretty much could have guessed that it was going to be her. If you're going to have Silver be, like, suspicious of Sally of all characters of being the traitor, then it kind of, like, I think pretty much set a lot of things in motion, but we just didn't notice it until later on. But yeah, the other reason, like I said, was to establish that this was an alternate universe, but also establish the fact that, we have a new generation of freedom fighters in the Mobius years later canon. Now, what's interesting about this is Ken Penders afterwards had come out and pretty much had argued the fact that, one, they didn't have the rights to do this without his permission, if you will, because he wasn't seeing any royalties. And if they say what I think they're about to say here, and I'll have to read it myself, basically he still stood by the fact that this was indeed the future of Mobius. Despite what, they said, that this was indeed the future. But continuing on, and I quote, now we're into the trivia category, the trivia section. And this is pretty much, I think, where it wraps up, I believe. Let me check. Oh, no, I got a few more. But here's the trivia section. Now, now we're in the behind-the-scenes scenario, if you will, the entire thing. We're in the behind-the-scenes deal. And this is some of the trivia that goes into that. And I quote, the trivia here. That's what it says right there. Just to make sure, if you will, so you guys can see that yourself. Or in the trivia section. And I quote, this is what it says. While still considering a possible future, Light Mobius bore the closest resemblance to what would actually occur in the Primacin. Okay, let me reread that. Trivia section. And I quote, while still considering a possible future, Light Mobius bore the closest resemblance to what actually occur in the Primacin during the 200 years between the present day and 3437 PXE, as seen by the pieces of evidence in the latter that versions of Lawless in the future Freedom Fighters existed during that time, among other indications. Continuing on. In other words, what he's saying is that because Light Mobius resembled bore the closest resemblance to what would occur in the Prime Mobius, that everything that happened during the Ian Flynn run, pretty much, is like saying, hey, that is what would have happened had Ken Penders continued the story, from what I can tell. Now, continuing on, and I quote, it is unknown whether this remained true after Silva stopped the traitor to the Knothole Freedom Fighters. In the very brief gap between said event and the activation of the second Genesis wave. The characters of Sonic and Sally's children, Sonia and Matic, were named after the Sonic Underground characters of the same names, like I mentioned earlier, possibly as a tribute since nothing of the series had any major role in the comics. The name of this possible future, like Mobius, was provided by artist John Gray in Super Sonic Special Magazine #4, where he also mentioned Dark Mobius, another possible future. And that's basically where the whole, alternate universe kind of thing came into play, even though, like I said, Ken Penders has gone on record in saying that Mobius years later is the exact future. Now, going on to the next category, which is called Knuckles 20 years later, this is where it gets interesting from a behind-the-scenes situation. And I quote, Knuckles 20 years later. Prior to the release of Mobius 25 years later, another possible future storyline was planned out for the comics. Known as Knuckles 20 years later, it would have featured Mobius coming under attack from some unknown threat 20 years into the future of the comic, and a new villain called Dr. Droid, originally introduced in Sonic Super Special #7. This is the same threat that Locke was shown a vision of by the ancient walkers, prompting him to the experimentation that made Knuckles into a mutant echidna, and in which Princess Sally saw during her first contact with the source of all. However, the storyline was cancelled before being published. However, various aspects of the storyline were included in the official Mobius 25 years later story. Events that would have appeared in Knuckles 20 years later include, and this is what's interesting. Events that would have appeared in Knuckles 20 years later include, because some of this, as I just read off, were incorporated, because the storyline was canceled before it could happen, some of the elements were incorporated into the Mobius 25 years later deal. And I quote, events that would have appeared in Knuckles 20 years later include, Lawless Sue would have still been a teenager, but at the age of 14, other than her Mobius 25 years later counterpart, who is 16. The future timeline that was featured in Sonic in Your Face would have also been featured with Sonic and Sally's children, Sonia and Matic, who are both named after the 90s cartoon television show Sonic Underground characters, who by this time are also teenagers. They would have been around 13 years old, although it wouldn't have been known if Maximilian is alive or dead, as in Sonic in Your Face. So they weren't sure whether or not Sally's father was deceased or he was still around. Just like in Mobius 25 years later, Lawless Sue would have Knuckles like her father, but retractable. There was going to be more emphasis on Lawless Sue portraying her as a main character, such as Knuckles in this storyline and some possible others. Like I said earlier, I think whoever put this on the fandom site didn't reread what they had typed up and anything. So, it's not their fault, but still, what are you gonna do? Continuing on, and I quote, Lala Sue's character design was supposed to be a lot like her design now, but more of her mother's appearance than her father's, who personally she was going to have. Knuckles' appearance would have been a little different. For one thing, he would have had a metallic left eye, and besides the outfit he has in Mobius 25 years later, he also has a metallic hand similar to Krochik, or whatever his name is. So basically they're saying that not only would he have a cybernetic eye, he would have a hand as well. As for Julie Sue, Ken Penders made it very clear that just because she was less cybernetics than before, that it doesn't mean she has become some domesticated housewife. She still has some kick-butt attitude she still has the same kick-butt attitude she had since she was a teenager. The story was going to open up with a doctor telling Julie Sue she was pregnant, but that was just to tip off the readers that this was going to be a storyline like no other. So in other words, basically there was a lot of stuff that would have happened had they gone with the original Knuckles 20 years later story arc that didn't happen, and some things that did happen or were planned for Knuckles 20 years later that got incorporated into Mobius 25 years later. So yeah, interesting history, and again I'll provide a link down below so you guys can check it out yourselves. Now we're getting into the final section here, which is the notes. And again, this is all now the behind the scenes stuff, but this is the notes section, if you will. And I quote, the year 32, and this is notes, and I quote, the year 3261 was provided in Sonic the Hedgehog issue 134 for this time period. However, the year 3262 was provided by some of the series of events, such as Lala Sue's unveiling ceremony in Sonic Universe number 5. It is unknown why these events took place a year after they did in the unaltered timeline, though it may have been a result of Sonic changing events in the past. It is also possible that the scene of Lala Sue dancing with Knuckles was a different event altogether, but simply had similar characteristics such as the location. These events were mistakenly labeled as being in 3263 in Sonic Universe number 5. This is impossible as the year 3262 was provided for events taking place right after King Shadow's defeat. It is likely that the year was supposed to be shown, or it is likely that the year was supposed to be shown was 3262, as that year is provided in 3 panels directly afterwards in the issue. The year 3262 is considered the proper year for the series of these events. So yeah, I do apologize if I kind of had a hard time reading some of that, but you kind of get what I was getting at there. And again, I'll provide a link down below. But yeah, basically that's a lot to really take into, from a story aspect and a behind the scenes aspect as to what this was all about. But again, like I said, Ken Penders originally wanted this to be the established continuity. He did not want this to be an alternate universe. He did not want this to be, as they would call it at the time, another place, a scenario. He wanted this to be the actual continuity. He wanted this to be the actual future of said continuity. However, as we read there, some people within Archie Comics and within the Sonic comic writing team, as well as those at Sega, mostly Sega of America and the Sonic team, all felt that wasn't possible, that shouldn't be possible. And so when Ian Flynn came on board, he pretty much established by having Silver show up in the Mobius 30 years later story arc in Sonic Universe, that this was indeed an alternate universe. This was an alternate reality. And he has, and here's the thing, as much as some people may agree with that or not agree with that, if he wants to go that route to make things less confusing, because that was his goal when he came on board originally, then that's his choice. And there are some people that actually appreciated that, because the one thing about the Mobius Years Later storyline, when Ken Penders did it, like I said, is he wanted to make it the true definitive future of the established continuity. But the reason why that was all changed when Ian Flynn came on board, much to Ken's dismay, is because basically you would be giving away the spoilers of the Freedom Fighters defeating Dr. Robotnik, aka Dr. Eggman, and winning the war. But the way Ken Penders had written it when he was working on it was, yeah, things were okay, but there was still a danger out there, and it was a danger that was going to destroy the planet if something wasn't taken care of. And he basically put into a lot of factors that occurred, from the Ultimate Annihilator, the Cosmic Interstate, stuff like that, to being the reason why the planet was falling apart. So yeah, he had a legitimate reasoning to want to make it the continuity for that time, because like I said, the way he ended it was, pretty much he left it up to interpretation of the viewers, of the readers, because the way he ended it, we see panels in the last issue, in the last page, of the present of the Freedom Fighters, of the Chaotix, and basically saying, hey, and basically pretty much saying, hey, the future is what you make it, or something like that. But again, he had it established in his mindset that this was going to be the definitive future, and that had it continued on, had he been able to continue it on, or whoever would have taken over afterwards, like Ian Flynn did, that they would have kept it that way as well. But again, what happened is Ian Flynn came on board and said, no, that's not going to happen. And he had several people backing him up. Those at Sonic Team, Sega of America, Archie Comics, they said, no, this is not going to be the alternative future. However, because I think Ian Flynn and all of them enjoyed the concept, they all agreed to making an alternate reality. And that's why they had Silver, kind of be incorporated in the 30 Years Later story arc in Sonic Universe. Not only to kind of establish that, but also, like I said, at the same time, kind of hint at the fact that maybe the traitor was a certain princess, at that time a queen now, that we weren't probably aware of, being the traitor, or how that was going to be. But he had basically put Silver in there to accomplish two things. Kind of establish that this was an alternate universe reality, or possible future, what if future, and that potentially Sally could be the traitor that Silver's looking for. But yeah, looking back on it, almost 20 years later, the Mobius Years Later story arc is one that has an intriguing history, and one that's still still felt to this day, if you will. It's still felt to this day, and the obvious evidence of that is, what Ken Penders is trying to do with the Lawless Suit Chronicles. But what do you guys think? What were your thoughts on Mobius Years Later when it happened? Comment down below. Let me know what your thoughts are there, as well as in the live chat. And I will talk to y'all later.